Hello. Today I have a video that no one asked for but many people need, and that is how to draw 2D references as a 3D artist. I just quickly want to go over why I'm making this video. So the thing is, I know many 3D artists cannot do 2D art, but if you're doing concepting to make an environment or a character or something like that, I think there's no better way to do it than in a 2D context. 2D just gives you the most freedom and the most speed when expressing ideas. The other point I want to bring up is that 2D gives you a massive head start in the 3D game. To give a personal example, take a look at this. This is actually the first model I ever made. I'm certainly not saying Pixar's got their eye on me after seeing this or anything like that. But what I am saying is that this is like a very decent result for like the third time I opened the software. 2D just gives you insanely good fundamentals of 3D. So what I'm trying to say is that even if you only care about 3D, time spent doing 2D is time well spent. I can tell you that as a character artist, every single character that I've ever made has been concepted in 2D. Okay, I think that's enough motivation for this video. So what I'm actually going to be showing you in this video is how to draw a simple sketch of a character. I'm specifically going to be approaching this from the angle of people looking for shortcuts. So this is not a 2D art tutorial per se. This is specifically meant for people who don't know how to do 2D art but want to draw references. Alright, with all that said, for the purposes of this video, we're going to be drawing Uzaki-chan, because my audience's lust for big boobs is insatiable. The program I recommend you use for this is called Krita. It's completely free and it's really powerful. In this case, since we're just going to be doing a line art, we don't need any fancy features or anything like that. Just pick a brush you like, select an empty layer, and let's get started. So the first tip that I have in this video, and this is like an omega important tip, is construction. You need to construct your character. This is non-negotiable. Kind of like how in 3D we make a base mesh before we start sculpting. In 2D, we construct a simple version of our subject using simple shapes. Spheres, rectangles, trapezoids, that sort of thing. Personally, I like to stick to boxes for most features. So in this step, you have several objectives. The first objective is getting the proportions right. You can always adjust the proportions later as well, but the sooner you get them right, the better. If you're a beginner, I strongly recommend you use another picture as a reference for your drawing. Keep in mind, if you're drawing an anime character, you need to use an anime image as reference. The proportions of an anime character are generally speaking non-realistic, so you need to use a reference that reflects anime proportions. The second objective in the stage is to get the pose right. Now, since this is just meant to be a reference, it doesn't have to be an insane pose. Especially if you intend to trace the reference, you might want to keep the pose axis aligned. I personally never trace references. I would strongly recommend you don't either. For me, the point of a reference is to have something to look at when you're trying to figure out who the character is. If you forgot what the eyes are like, if you forgot what the angle is supposed to be at some particular part, that's where the reference comes in. Your goal should not be to recreate the reference. Your goal should be to use the reference to create something new. Anyway, since this video is meant for beginners, let's keep the pose simple. Once the blockout is done, we can cautiously start adding some details. Generally speaking, it's good practice to add details in layers, so that means you don't just focus on one part until its completion, you just go over the whole image again and again. I would strongly recommend you use this method, but I will not be using it here. The more experienced you are, the more you can get away with just adding a lot of details at once. So anyway, we're going to begin with the face here. Now there is an insane variety in the types of anime faces that are out there. I'm not going to talk about the design or the anatomy because this depends heavily on the style and the character. What I'm going to talk about is practical matters. So the first thing I have to tell you as a beginner is use confident lines. If you've ever drawn as a child, you may have fallen into this bad habit of drawing little strokes to define a big stroke. This just looks extremely unprofessional and ugly. What you want to do is have confident strokes. If you absolutely cannot get confident strokes and your technical skill is so low that you cannot draw, one final Hail Mary you can try to do is using vector graphics. By the way, I completely forgot to mention this, but I'm using a tablet in this video. If you don't have a tablet, it might be quite difficult to follow along. In this case, I would recommend using vector graphics like I suggested, because these can be done using a mouse, or drawing with pen and paper and taking a photograph at the end. Anyway, confident strokes. The second practical tip I have for you is use symmetry. Krita actually has a symmetry option, so if you want to draw a completely symmetrical character, you can use that if you want. In my opinion, characters tend to look better if there's a little bit of asymmetry, so I tend not to use it. But whatever you do, you should flip the canvas often and make sure that the mirror image of your character is okay. In Krita, you can flip the canvas using the M key. Okay, I bet a lot of you are getting tired right about now, so let's take a little intermission to talk about boobs. In particular, I want to demonstrate what I always say about not putting boobs too high. So take a look at this first sketch. This is something I often see with the boobs almost being attached to the clavicle. To me, this just looks like we're in space, like it makes absolutely no sense to me. So this is very bad. Do not do this. A more natural height can be found in the second sketch. In this case, I am still imagining that the breasts are supported, so they're either in a bra or in a shirt. Keep in mind, these boobs are absolutely massive. Without support, they're just gonna sag no matter what. Which brings us to our third sketch, which is what I would expect them to do if there was no support. Now, you don't have to go this extreme with it, especially with how far apart the breasts are. My general rule of thumb for this weight class of breast is that when the breasts are supported, they should reach about to the end of the rib cage, and when they're not supported, they should reach more or less to the belly button. Okay, so now I'm basically in the process of going over the body again and adding the clothes. You'll see me adding some folds. This is mostly cosmetic, and honestly you don't need to really worry about it. What you do need to worry about is defining the shape of the body. So I've gone over this already in my sculpting tutorial, so I'm not going to go over it again here. But the general process is you erase a small part of the construction and then you redraw it with a more refined shape. This is also the time to add any details you want, such as the knees. But honestly, I find that for anime, there's actually very little refining that actually needs to be done. In more or less just a matter of minutes, I'm basically done. By the way, here in the thighs you can see what I was talking about in my sculpting video. The thing about the thin thighs having this sort of in-out pattern. Just wanted to mention that. So yeah, don't be discouraged if you can't get a result like this on your first try. I've been drawing for over 10 years at this point, so keep that in mind. Here are my closing tips for this section. Keep the shape simple. Even after you refine the shape, there should be a big simple shape at the base of it. You know how in 3D I always say that you should keep the planes readable? Well, the equivalent thing in 2D is keeping the shape simple. Second tip I have is don't be afraid to use a transform tool to move things around. If something looks wrong, it probably is. You need to fix it. Just use the lasso tool to mark out the area that feels wrong and just move it where it feels right. Erase as needed and try to make it better. Final tip I have is take breaks. The value of being able to reevaluate your work after a break cannot be overstated. After you come back after a 30-minute break, you will see things that you couldn't see before, I guarantee it. It's the same concept as with flipping the canvas. It gives you a new perspective on your work. Okay? Now let's get into a bonus section of the video. As a 3D character artist, one other thing you're pretty likely to have to draw is eyes. So I thought why not quickly go over how I draw eyes for 3D. So once again, I start with a base sketch. Basically, I just draw in these big areas with flat colors. So the areas are a dark spot in the middle, a highlight in the lower half, and another dark spot in the upper half. Take your time picking the colors. The most important thing in this stage is to use colors that you like. To finish the blocking stage, I add these details such as the outlines and these lines that are supposed to simulate the texture of an iris. So the next step is when it should start to look good. So I take all the layers that I made so far and I merge them together. And then I take a blur brush and I blur everything together. Well, to be more precise, I blur the edges of the shapes together. So from here on out, I approach adding details to the eyes by adding new layers and modifying the base layer using filters. You'll recognize the filters from the Blender Mix Color node. These are the exact same filters, although Krita has more of them. First, I use the multiplier layer to add some shadows to the iris. Next, I use an overlay layer to add some highlights. Next, I use the normal layer to add some more details to the side of the eye. You could use a multiplier layer just as well. And one final multiplier layer at the end to make the iris a little bit darker. And there you have it. That's a basic eye texture. Now you could obviously still refine this. I did this in like 5 minutes, but just by following these steps, you should be able to make something similar. All right, that's all I have for this video. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.